The rest of the implementation for displaying an album's list of songs is pretty much the same as the steps we took to implement the album list. So first, we need a custom class for the table view controller. To the controllers group, let's add a new file. This is going to be a subclass of UI table view controller, and we're going to name this one album detail controller. As always, we'll start off by getting rid of all the boilerplate. So we don't need to receive memory warnings and all the way down to the bottom. So the only thing you should have in here is view.did.load, really. The album detail controller is going to display information about the album and information about the songs. The way we display these sets of information differ mildly in their implementation, in that the song information is displayed by the table view, so we need to implement data source methods and use cell prototypes. The album information, though, well, those are just static views, so we can create outlets and assign information. Let's start there. So first, we have a class now. Let's go back to main.storyboard, select this new view controller scene, and assign the custom class as the underlying class for this scene. So class, we need to select the table view controller. There we go. So this is the album detail controller. Now, without doing that, if you don't assign this underlying class, then you won't be able to create outlets. Next, let's switch to the assistant editor and select the detail controller. Zoom in a bit. And this is manual. Let's go to automatic and pull up the detail controller. And in here, let's create a few outlets. So first, the artwork view, which we'll control drag over, and we'll name artwork view. Next is the album title label, the album genre label, and finally the album release date label. In the album detail controller, so let's head back there, we'll set these outlets up right when the view loads. Now to do that, we need data. So at the very top, let's create a stored property to hold on to the instance of the album. So var album of type album. Let's also add a method in here to configure the view with an album. So after view.did.load, we'll say func configure with album. In the body of this method, we could just go ahead and assign the values from the album instance directly. But remember, we have some date formatting work, and I like to keep that kind of logic housed in small objects. You may also have noticed that the information we're displaying in the header view of this table view is identical to what's in an instance of an album cell. So one way we could approach this is to just reuse the album cell view model to assign and format the information into the format we need and assign it to the text labels. But I don't want to do that. It would obviously mean less code by reusing that object, but these are two distinct views. They may look the same right now, but in the future, who knows, they may not be. If we modify the album view model to format the date differently or remove the genre label from the cell, all of that affects what we display in this table view cell as well, or in the table view header view, because we're reusing the same object. Now, in addition, the album cell view model doesn't contain any information about the image we want to display because of the way we're going to handle that, which we'll get to in a bit. So we're going to create a new view model just for this detail controller. So right-click on the view models group, new file, Swift file, and we're going to call this album detail view model. For now, this is going to be identical to the implementation of the album cell view model. So we're just going to copy paste all of this over and then edit the struct name. So instead of album cell view model, this is album detail view model. In the configure method now, so go back to the album detail controller, in here, we can provide a basic implementation. So we'll say let view model equal album detail view model. And we'll initialize that with an album. So we'll pass that through. We'll need to add an implementation for the artwork view. So for now, we're just going to leave a comment. This sort of depends on how we write our networking code. So we're going to circle back and fix this. Add implementation for artwork view. What's left? So we have the title label. And we can simply say view model.title here. We have the genre label. And to that, we can assign the view model.genre. And then finally, the release date label .text equal view model.release date. We need to call this method somewhere, so we'll call it inside view.didLoad. So we'll say view.didLoad, or rather inside view.didLoad, we'll say configure with album, pass the album through, and we'll force unwrap it. Dangerous, I know. Or we can even be safe and say if let album equal album. Being safe is always better. Configure with album. Okay, let's test this and make sure we have everything we need, except for that image part. So the way we do this is to set up the album detail controller after a user has tapped on an album in the album list controller. So like we did in the last video, let's go to the list controller, and at the bottom, we're going to provide an implementation for prepare for segue. So we'll say navigation here. Prepare for segue. Again, we want to make sure we're executing the right segue. So if segue.identifier double equals, remember this identifier here show album, not albums. And then like before, step 1 is to figure out what album the user tapped. This is easy. We know this. So we'll get the index path. We'll say if let selected index path equal table view dot index path for selected row. Again, here our data source is private, so we need a way to access that. So we'll go to the album list data source, and at the bottom, do the same thing. We'll add a helper method, and we'll say func album at index path, and return an album from our data set. So return albums index path.row. So now back in the list controller, so we're selecting an album in the list controller and then navigating to the detail controller. So in here we'll say let selected album equal data source dot album at index path. So provide the selected index path. And then, like we did in the search results controller, when we select an album to go to the list controller, remember at this point we don't have any songs because we need to make that lookup request again. So for now, stub data. So selected album dot songs equal stub dot songs. What's left? Well, we need to get a reference to the album detail controller by querying the segue's destination property and casting to the right type. And then we can assign the album over to the right stored property. Take this for a spin. So if we navigate all the way to the end, we should finally have, there we go, a header view set up and in place. Now, I realize that much of this was just repeating some of the exact same work we did with the list controller. But I figure going this approach is a bit more beneficial to you. I could have dropped all of this code into starter files, or we could have copy-pasted in large blocks, but we've only worked with table views once, so I don't want to assume that you know every single thing we're doing right at the top of your head. So perhaps repeating all this isn't a bad idea. In the next video, let's get a data source and a cell class in place so that we can show information about the songs.